Are you stuck? Why not try Magic and the Occult? Hey, it's worth a shot, right? I mean, what else is working these days? I have a brand new free guided meditation just for you. We've been cooking it up here at the lab, and it's really awesome. You can download it for free at start.magic.me. That is start.magic, magic.me. And here's my challenge to you. If you can do that meditation for 7 minutes a day, it's only 7 minutes and change. If you can do that meditation 7 minutes a day for 7 days, how much can your life radically change? A lot would be my wager. Check it out. Take me up on that challenge. Let me know what happens. Start.magic.me. And we will also send you some emails of all the best podcasts and content that we've been putting out and introducing you to magic.me and all the newest stuff that we have cooking up at the site. For instance, our Introduction to Magic course. It's a great deal all around for the low cost of free. Start.magic.me, start.magic.me. All right, I will see you there. Our guest today has been long in coming, Carl Abrahamsson, who is one of the most prolific editors and publishers of occult material in the world right now. He has done tons and tons of publications, coffee table books, documentaries, music, just a tremendously productive guy. His new book is called Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan, Infernal Wisdom from the Devil's Den. Let me tell you a little bit about it from the back of the book. With his creation of the infamous Church of Satan in 1966 and his best-selling book, The Satanic Bible, in 1969, Anton Zander LaVey, 1930 to 1997, became a controversial celebrity who basked in the attention and even made a successful career out of it. Who was Anton LaVey behind the public persona that so easily provoked Christians and others intolerant of his views? One of the privileged few who spent time with the Black Pope in the last decade of his life, Carl Abrahamsson met Anton LaVey in 1989, sparking an infernally empowering friendship. Oh. In this book, Abrahamson explores what LaVey was really about, where he came from, and how he shaped the esoteric landscape of the 1960s. The author shares in-depth interviews with the notorious Satanist's intimate friends and collaborators, including LaVey's partner Blanche Barton, his son Xerxes LaVey, current heads of the Church of Satan Peter Gilmore and Peggy Nadramia, occult filmmaker Kenneth Enger, LaVey's personal secretary Margie Bauer, film collector Jack Stevenson, and film historian Jim Morton. Abrahamson also shares never-before-published material from LaVey himself, including discussions between LaVey and Genesis Peerage and transcribed excerpts from LaVey's never-released Hail Satan video. Providing inside accounts of the Church of Satan and activities at the Black House, this intimate exploration of Anton LaVey reveals his ongoing role in the history of culture and magic. So let's get right into it. This was a super fun conversation on a topic that I really don't know a whole lot about, but Carl knows lots. All right, let's jump into it. Lovely to meet you. Thank you for coming on the podcast. There are probably infinite topics that we could talk about, from Jen to Anton LaVey to literally every single part of a culture. So there's a lot there. But I have your new book here, and maybe why don't we just get started just talking about that, since that's what you have. That's one of the 18 books you have out right now. Yeah. That you currently just released in the last month. Yeah. So I'm super curious. So I obviously have, Anton LaVey, everyone knows he's an inescapable presence, and he's often the first person that people encounter when they first researching the occult. And of course, he is the greatest best-selling occult author of all time by a long shot. And I think probably it's because he just did not beat around the bush at all and just went straight to it. But I have never been super interested in Anton LaVey, to be perfectly honest, but this book looks really good, and you obviously spent a lot of time with him, and you have a lot to say about him. So I'm curious. Tell us about Anton LaVey and what your take on him is, and your time with him.
Right, right. Those are major topics, but the thing is that, as you say, you can't really escape him because he's out there in the open. And today, I would say his presence is almost on a mainstream level. Inclusion in American Horror Story, whatever that season was called, and the books are still selling, and his iconographic face is on t-shirts, and it's just weird how that legacy can live on, and he would be super happy, of course. And then you have this legacy is a very difficult word. It's, could be charged with so many things, but I think that what made me want to put this book together, that of course had to do with the film that came before it. It started out as a documentary film that came out in 2019. And this sort of the impetus or the incentive for me to write that was that I had over a period of, say, 10 years, this growing premise inside me, saying, what the hell happened there? Because I went to meet him the first time in 1989, and we were sort of friends and met regularly up until his death in 97. And those were very meaningful visits for me. This was the same time as I was doing a lot of occultural, let's call it occultural networking, and being very active in many groups and orders and, currents, whatever, as you do when you're young. And I cherished those times, those moments at the Black House, and when we met. And I felt that he had given me something beyond inspiration, because you're always inspired by father figures or mentors or whatever you want to call them. And I tried to figure out, whoa. Was that a strategy on his side, or so I decided to talk to some of the people I knew within the Church of Satan from back then, and they all had the same sort of vague feeling in a way. Yeah, he was absolutely, presenting stuff to us that was sort of not niched, but that he thought that we could enjoy based on a kind of intuitive resonance. And he was usually, as they say, right on the money. I was very interested in film at the time. That was my thing. And we, of course, talked a lot about film. And he sort of, I guess, analyzed me in a way, seeing, how much does he know about film and what kinds of films does he like, things like that. And the same thing happened then, that when I talked to this first group of people that I knew, I also branched out into people that I didn't know but at the time, but that I got to know, and because they had also been at the Black House at this time, and asked them the same thing. Did you have this feeling that there was things going on between the lines? And they all had that feeling. And then you could say, oh, it's just, memory and this projection and there's missing someone that you loved and, things like that. But it seemed that he had a kind of an MO of reading people, and if he liked you, he would be giving you things generously, both overtly and also very much between the lines, different things for different people. So that was one kind of legacy that I felt that he consciously created. You have, genetic legacy through kids, and you have book legacy through the books he published, and you can't really, when you're dead, you can't really control any of that, but you can live on, as it says in many wise texts, like in the brains and sinews of those who live on, whether they met the person or not. Just this thing of memory and how memory is carried on. And it became an increasingly fascinating project. And I felt that after the film, I had so much stuff, because you have to edit out so much when you're making a film. And I still had those transcriptions. I said, pardon my French, but fucking hell, this is a great material that needs to be anthologized in the book form. And that's how that happened. And then, of course, I can also look back at some similar projects that I've made recently, like with Jen, for instance. There was the Sacred Intent book, and before that there was the Change Itself documentary, and the third and final spoken word album that we did. And it's also kind of a summing up of a long friendship that was hugely, quintessentially beautiful and important to me, just like LaVey had been. And at the same time, in 2019, I made a film about, or a documentary together with Kenneth Anger, who had also been a source of influence and a friend since also 1989. So it was like, I guess this era for me is like, I don't know, summing up in a way. And I think it has to do with, you come to a certain age, some would say it's like the Saturn returns. I've had 2 Saturn returns now, or I'm right in it. So for me, it's a very good thing to start looking through the diaries and see what patterns are repeating, what can I change, now is a good time to do that.
Interesting.
And I really love that.
That sounds very much like Jen, when you're talking about like how he was interacting with people and reading them and passing things on. One of the things that I always found about like a culture, a cult, is it doesn't just mean occult magic. It's like you meet these people and they pass on all of the stuff that influenced them. That's kind of occult in the sense of the mainstream has forgotten it, but it's so important. And whether that's music or films or. With LaVey, for instance, it seems like he was very much influenced by this kind of Jack London idea of being this, man's man out in the world, and that I always found fascinating about him.
Absolutely, and you're absolutely right also, because sometimes it is the most useful things are between the lines, and you can know, if you're a somewhat eloquent person, you can write a book and you can say that I believe that magic is this and this, and basically we're all trying to do that in some way. But the thing is that to have magical transmission in a way, it has to be done almost face to face, or Jen's thing with the touching of hands, and for LaVey it was very much sharing a space and him playing music and really changing the atmosphere, and then came like a wink or a smile or a gleam or just one sentence that sort of in a Zen kind of way past everything.
That's so cool.
Yeah, and when you've had those experiences, you and I have had them both. I think you come to a point where you are done filtering. You just feel that I have been given so much. Now it's time to finish the filtering and just give it back, or give it forward rather, to the young ones in a sense, because it is very much a spirit that lives on, and you can call it like the Burroughs Geissian axis, or you could call it the LaVey Satanic axis, or the psychedelic Robert Anton Wilson axis. They're all axes working more or less parallel towards a strengthening of the individual's sense of the individual, encouraging individuation, almost regardless how you do it. Some people can be reckless, jump off a cliff, that like Jan used to say, and others can be very meticulously careful and almost empirical in their work. And others are just Taoist free floating, or you can be like LaVey, and many of those kinds of Satanists go very much into aesthetics. It's a very aestheticized and aesthetic dominated philosophy and magical system, where you make sure that your environment and your time also is filled with a maximum input of things that make a kind of resonance reverberation that maximized space-time. You can send out your charge.
That's really cool. That's interesting. I've always been of the more like engineering type approach. If I just want the technology that works, but as you're saying that makes, and having just known Satanists that are very much like that, that makes a lot of sense. Particularly if you're in that as we all are now, in a home environment, like a lot.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that it doesn't take a lot to understand how these things really work. For most people who live in an apartment or one room or a tiny apartment or tiny house, just having one little corner or tiny space really set aside for magic. Building your temple, or again, referencing Jan, try to alter everything in the sense that whatever you do, whatever you find, make it something holy, something very special for you, and that thing will feed back just by your doing that, changing space and changing time. And for LaVey, and also I would have to say a lot came from Kenneth Anger, who had this idea of the total environment parallel or perhaps even earlier than LaVey, and collecting stuff very much and the aesthetic mind frame, taking care of detail, making sure that everything's positioned well. And for an outsider who doesn't have the terminology, you could say that, oh, he's just, an old queen rearranging his things in a very meticulous way. But from a magical point of view, it's, moving this vintage picture of Clara Bow closer to the vintage picture of Bela Lugosi on your shrine in your home, which is painted, and it's just like a shrine to old Hollywood, and things will happen. Those pictures will and you can, in a way, necromantically have a communication with them. It all depends on how much you want to feed back with your own creation.
That's fascinating. That's really interesting. It's making me just immediately think about how I could do this more on my own. Interesting. So, but there is something, I think there is something really satanic about that in a deep sense of, one thing that always has impressed me about the satanic philosophy is that it's so antinomian in the true sense, in that it is fixating purely on the material world in such contrast, and just going like totally into just like surface appearance and glamour with like no substance. And I think that's actually really refreshing after, in a sense, like, because so many other occult traditions are like, what does it all mean? I
don't think it's entirely true according to the way I see it, because it's always a difficult dichotomy, this thing with, material versus spiritual. And I think that LaVey early on very much was super open-minded and researched things. And he was friends not only with Anger but also with other Thelemites coming from the Los Angeles team, not as far back as Parsons, but certainly with Cameron and other people, as shockwaves after Parsons in a way. They were around, and he was interested, and in that research, also him coming from a kind of a carny background where you have cold reading and you have more like manipulation and sort of tricks and stuff, stage magic. But he was very open-minded and aware of that. Applying a psychological terminology to these things can be more helpful than having constantly these symbolic things where, it's this demon Bartzabel for this kind of working and da. That becomes almost like a quagmire where you have to master a structure, you have to master a terminology. On the other hand, he chose the most controversial symbol of all, or at least in this cultural sphere, Satan. But that he did knowingly, not because he worshipped some anthropomorphic beast, but because he knew it would make a dent in people's psyche. You had the evangelical Christians on one side, and then the spaced out hippies on one side, and they all feared this symbol. So it was a power packing punch that he had at exactly the right time. So it became very successful, and that's exactly what he wanted. Then later on, you have this thing where it's all about, as you say, materialism. It's about success. It's like someone called it quite brilliantly Ayn Rand with pentagrams in a way. But there's more to it than that, because there was already an acknowledgement in the Satanic Bible, which was his first book in a sense, of this dark force in nature. And already there you have something that is not expressed through the natural sciences and empirical background, the dark force of nature. Okay, so you can tap into this dark force. Is that the dark force that is like the German romantics, nighttime and the full moon and wind howling and wolves howling? And that could be it. That could be very evocative for a magical working. But there's also, a very dark force of nature on a highway that's sort of decrepit, and you have these asphalt flowers coming through the hard rock or the hard asphalt. There's a lot of power in that simply natural force that can break down basically anything given the opportunity. That's why I think that gardening is ultimately the human triumph and also failure, because you can do as much weeding and gardening as you want, turn your back and it will be overgrown right away. So that's the dark force of nature. It's a force so powerful, and he decided to call that a satanic energy, because it does go against the grain of the herd trying specifically have the human herd or humans survive, whereas in fact we won't. We know our lifespan is it's maybe 70 years. You don't know. It could be 50, it could be 80, it could be 100, but we don't know. We know that it's final. And as for humanity as such, it seems that we're going against some kind of extinction, or at least weeding, and that's also part of this dark force of nature. And then my question to myself is this necessarily spiritual? Well, you could say that it's ensouled. I would say that it's ensouled. Maybe other, Church of Satan or LaVey wouldn't agree, but he definitely acknowledged that there's more to it than simple causal manipulation of this and that, or a manipulation of someone that makes that person do what you want, as in, carny magic or stage magic, or hypnotic or mesmerism, that kind of thing. He believed in the power of magic, meaning that you do something that is out of space, out of time, that creates a kind of a butterfly effect that sort of flutters on, and that will have an effect. And however, how do you describe that? We don't know how to explain that or describe that fully. He was very much of he had a psychological bent. He was a self-professed Freudian. He loved Jung. He loved Reich. And Reich well, as you wrote for Fenris Wolf. He loved Reich. And people tend to forget that there are so many possible models to explain, the occult. What is it? It's like philosophy and ancient primal science existing in the dark. Then it comes out into the open and it becomes something else. It's constantly morphing. However, how I think that it works is through our own interpretation of what we see and what we interpret with our senses. So, for instance, if you're in a room and you're dressed completely neutral, as is the other person, and that person says, I am a Christian, you will project a whole lot of things on that person, even though he might look just like you or be dressed just like you and have no deviant behavior, as Christians often do. But anyway, and he will project things on you because you say, I'm Jason, I have a podcast about occultural things. Then you will immediately be branded as that because you have yourself.
Story of my life. Yes, I'm very aware.
But for instance, if someone came in and he said, instead of, he might be a Christian, but he says, I'm a Buddhist. But then during the conversation, you realize that he has tricked you or something. Then that creates a kind of a different ball game, and you might be, vindictive and try to, some shenanigans with him, and it might become very interesting. What I'm trying to say is basically that he believed that all of the hocus pocus had a very beneficial, cathartic effect, like a psychodramatic effect. The rituals they did early on in the Church of Satan. Was always explained in a kind of psychological language, modeled according to things like having a cathartic effect, having a cleansing of a traumatic experience by some kind of scapegoat ritual, by having the, almost kitschy nude altar lady in this black room for men to ogle and for women to admire or think that, oh, this is so kitschy in a way. But no matter what, it has an effect. He knew how to create that effect in mainstream culture, but also in the ritual chamber. And in the ritual chamber, there was no pussyfooting around that it was for real. There was, and that's what I mean. It's like he believed in
Interesting.
magic.
Yeah, I was going to ask you because it seems like starting with Dion Fortune and then into this era, it was such a rhetorical and marketing technique to use psychological language around magic because it was much more acceptable. But what I was going to ask you is, did they believe it was only that or much more? And I think you just answered that.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also a hyper-individualistic group, almost paradoxical, a group for non-joiners in a way. However, I know for a fact that he believed in magic, and many of the people, for instance, that are interviewed in the book and in the film, I asked them that sort of standard question: Do you think that he believed in that, or do you think that he saw things strictly materialist? And most of the people reply that he definitely believed in something between the lines, in this dark force of nature, in psychology as the core, but there were so many things that are still unexplained, perhaps even inexplicable for us. And perhaps that's the way it's supposed to be, because when things become too much in the open, too much dissected in a way, things lose their poetry. That's the thing. When it's mysterious and just beautiful, beauty can't be dissected, for instance.
Yeah, never reveal your pentacles, as I think Remus, the chaos magician, said at one point, or somebody said that. That's so interesting. Just everything you're saying is awesome. He sounds like an awesome person to spend time with, first and foremost.
We all are.
I hope so. But thank you. And you are as well. I was going to ask you, I'm curious how the Satanic panic played out in Europe, because I'm of the age where I grew up, like, Satanism, I feel, is so much more resonant than anything else in the occult world in America because we're such a crazy Christian country. Deep down. And I think, like, for instance, when you go to England, they're very much about like Austin Spare and Kenneth Grant and like this very kind of like English eccentric thing. And that really just does not play here at all, outside of maybe hipsters in New York, maybe, but for Americans, for the average American, the occult is very real in the sense that there's like this metaphysical war between Jesus and Donald Trump and Satan, and it's like, and real, and yeah, so Americans think this stuff is real, which is which is not the case, at least in my experience, certainly with people from England or Europe, where they're very much post-Christian, very cynical, so for that reason, it has such a different resonance here. And I'm of the age where I grew up in the Satanic panic. So like I was in grade school and cops were coming in and telling us that Satanists were going to abduct us into vans and all this insane stuff, none of which was true. And of course, there was the whole era with, that famous, what was it, Zena LaVey and Michael Aquino were on Geraldo's show defending themselves, and people, including LaVey, right, were like their lives were in threat. Like I remember reading that they had to spray paint the windows of that house black, and Zena would have to crawl under the windows as she went past them because people would shoot into the windows. So it was such an insane time here, and it's kind of has unfortunate resonances with now, because now in America we have this whole like QAnon mass insanity, and it's very similar, which is a little worrying. But I'm curious, what was there any, I know obviously there was what happened with Jen, but I'm wondering, I just don't, because I don't know the history. I mean, what was the resonance of this period on the continent? Was it different than the U.S. or was it similar? I don't know.
I think both, actually. The way I remember it, because I had I sort of matured throughout the 80s. Like early 80s, I was just like a little sponge taking in industrial music and all these intellectual and magical references contained in this music and community in a way, and sort of joining Topi and working with that. In Europe, the Satanic Panic was sort of from the mid 80s and onwards, perhaps slightly earlier.
Huh.
And of course, no internet. So you had these newsletters and tiny fanzines in a way, like Pagan News, and the IoT had Chaos International, which was a great fanzine magazine. And there were other things also. And slightly later, I created the Fenris Wolf, and there was this intellectual culture going on, which also contained news, right? So Sweden, totally secular, everything's fine, everything's okay. I had no problems ever until I like really stuck my chin out in a way with mainstream media.
What happened there? Not to derail you, but that sounds like a good story potentially. Okay, great.
But basically nothing happened in Sweden. In the UK, it was a different story, because they were all felt like these instigations of insane conspiracy theories and this and that. And what happened very concretely was that there were at that time beautiful occult bookstores. There was one called The Sorcerer's Apprentice, I think in Leeds, which was like the hub for the chaos magicians, and they published some stuff. They had stuff vandalized, like shop windows, and I remember reading about that in Pagan News, for instance. And so that was very hands-on and antithetical violence towards anything empowering individuals at this time. In the US, I think it was parallel but slightly delayed. It took a different form though, because in the US everything is so media saturated. You have the talk shows, and you have Geraldo, and you have these weird tabloids filled with fantasy, and all of them could point their finger at something so vague as Satan, meaning the anthropomorphic monster. There were problems, definitely, and that was one of the reasons why you could say that the first phase of the Church of Satan was from the 1966 up until the mid 70s. That was the heyday, glory days, success, exposure, etc. Then it got a little bit tiresome. LaVey said that I want to enjoy and be consequent to my philosophy and just be selfish and egotistical and enjoy myself, life enhancement. So he did that. And then when it turned into the 80s, I would say that there was kind of the third and final phase entering, where he got so much slack, and he didn't really have the power to muster up to be on yet another talk show, yet another radio show with morons. Why would he be? So I think that he let that come onto the lap of a younger generation, perhaps, but it didn't really amount to anything, because they were like rabid dogs in a way, just yapping away, and it led to things being thrown at the Black House, which is right in San Francisco on California Street, and they had to put up a fence, barbed wire fence, and sometimes have, as you said, like things for the window. And at some points, people actually shot at the house. I don't think it was for any longer period of time. LaVey also always had great contacts, great communication with the local police. He had actually worked as a photographer for the San Francisco Police Department in the early 60s. And that sort of lingered on. And he was always very open. He was very loved in the neighborhood, even though it was weird. They had known him for such a long time, from when he had a lion as a pet at home. It was just as you say, kind of an eccentric person. He was very eccentric. And, so after that, it was curtains down. People, there was no social, extravagant, flamboyant social living as had been before. What happened was that from mid 80s up until he died, it was basically kind of a regimen where you met at the Black House and you went out to dinner and then went back to the house and basically spent the night at the house watching movies, listening to music, talking. But there was never really any extroversion, meaning participation in events and things like that. He had done his share already. And I think in part, I wouldn't say all of it, but in part, it had to do with that potential danger of just being around and being a controversial, famous/infamous figure in a culture that was so antagonistic and irrationally so. Because it was never about, well, is Satan real? Da, da, da. It was just, as you have now with QAnon, it's completely irrational, emotional compensation from nitwits, basically, that that are dangerous.
Yeah. Where do you see the parallels between then and now? Do you feel that it's exactly the same, or do you feel like we're in a different situation with things now?
Yeah, well, I would say that the paradoxical thing is that it's the same, but it's not the same. It's the same in the sense that it's the same kind of people who are attracted to these, weird leaders or cultic people who want to, shepherd their sheep into nowadays much worse things than ever before. Back then it was basically religious, they're saying that this is bad and we have to stop this, stop the occult, make a cross over the pentagram, and that would be enough. But today it takes on completely different forms, but the mechanics and the dynamics are exactly the same as then. But as we can see, the effects of that, when you sort of strip away the psychotic Christianity and instead, put politics in there, then it becomes dangerous. It's exactly the same mechanics, but it has a different kind of effect, because it really doesn't matter if people are, speaking in tongues in a rural church and condemning Satan and the Satanists. That really doesn't amount to anything, or not much. But if you have a whole crew creating political ruckus and trying to impose, undemocratic behavior and effects, then that's a different story. But it's essentially the same. It's people using things as symbols, but in a kind of black magic sense, to simply to increase their own power greedily at the cost of those who are actually helping them forward.
Yeah, and it's kind of, it is sad, and it's kind of crazy. I'm thinking as you're saying that you were mentioning earlier that the original one was before the internet, and you would suspect that access to the internet would give people better access to information, but it's been completely the opposite, where it's just allowed people to just go into total psychosis. But so what happened when you said that you got a bit of you put your head above the trenches a little bit?
Well, it was this was early 90s then. I'd been going back and forth and met him almost every year, as often as I could. And I had bought the rights for the Satanic Bible and translated that into Swedish. That didn't come out until I think 95 or 96. But before that, I was very open about this, just as I had been and still was with Topi, for instance. I'd always shared information freely. I'd been on Swedish TV talking about sigilizing in, I don't know, 1987 or something. And it was just, then it was weird. But when it became Satanic, it was a different story. And there was a piece which was actually, when you read it, a great piece, but it had some pictures of me being youthful, posing with some kind of wand. It looked kind of, I don't know, intimidating in a youthful way. And that created some havoc in some weird people. And it was nothing. It was just like people, death threats on the phone, stuff like that, but nothing ever happened. And it's just, it taught me a lesson too, in the sense that, what am I really selling? And is it worth that agony of having to go to the police and make a little report? Not really. So I sort of cooled down. But on the other hand, a couple of years later, I did publish the Satanic Bible in Swedish, and it sold out, like hotcakes. So it's better to work and not be, I don't like to be a spokesperson of anything or anyone in a way. I like to recount what I have experienced myself. That's basically all I can or should do.
Interesting. Yeah, LaVey definitely kind of took if you'll pardon the pun, he really picked up his cross to walk with it there. In this, and I think that he probably was the great marketing genius of Matt, even more than Crowley in a sense. And he made himself into a meme, and that in a sense that guarantees his immortality, in the same way that Crowley's immortality is guaranteed, and hopefully Jen's immortality is guaranteed. But I do admire with Anton, because my entire career I've been trying to figure out just the right way to put it so that people will accept it, or it's not. I show that it's not weird, and I actually just admire LaVey for being like, no, here's a pentagram, it's just completely hitting it on the nose and not trying to. And I think people find that refreshing, actually. So I think
that's still true, because also we talk about memes and sort of this kind of culture we're living in today. You have this slightly older dichotomy, which is very useful, and it's this thing between signal and noise, and LaVey, for me, and obviously for a lot of other people too, was like pure signal. They had some symbols in there, but the symbols were part and parcel of the signal. And there's no obfuscation. Actually, that was one of his critiques against older arcane occultism, that it's so obfuscated for its own sake. Why would you need a symbol for something that might have been threatening in medieval times, but it's not anymore? It's time to make up some symbols or some methods that are applicable today, that have that powerful effect, because most of the Christian critique against whatever, pagan wisdom or witches or wise women existed back then was just their own repressed sexual fantasies taking monstrous forms. We can easily see that. Back then it was a different story, but that kind of repression sort of evaporated as human culture evolved into what we have today, which might perhaps be even too liberal. Where are the taboos? And because
it's no fun for occultists when nothing's taboo anymore. There's nothing to do.
Point of view, there's a great power in transgression.
Yeah,
and I think
yeah.
One of the trends, I prefer to call it a trend within contemporary occultism or magical philosophy, whatever, is the concept of Babylon, and well, the de-involvement and stuff like that. But I would argue, specifically coming back to Crowley and Crowley's writings about it, is that it's not so much a goddess evoked from the lust card, whatever. It can be that too, of course, if you want to, but it's merely a symbol of transgression. There's power in transgression, and the Nietzschean sense, which Crowley also adapted very much, is that the power comes from when you overcome your own hindrances inside, right? So the big taboo throughout the centuries has been sexual, very much so during the first half of the 20th century also. So how do you transgress and generate that power that comes from transgressing? Well, you become honest. You become honest about who you are sexually, for instance, or philosophically, or break away from domineering parents, whatever it is. There's an insane amount of power in that. And that's the power of transgression. And that's what Crowley meant in his definition of Babylon. Of course, it's an attractive form with some voluptuous, very sex positive young lady breaking away from the patriarchy, whatever. That works as a Babylonic symbol. But it could equally well be the other way around. Someone who has been too liberally raised that goes into transgression, into a more celibacy, for instance. There's the same kind of transgression, just reverse, and there's an equal amount of power. And that's really the kind of how I see the Babylonic formula in a way. And I can't remember now how we slid into this.
No, that's great though. I really love that. I'll argue perhaps, perhaps controversially, I'll argue that I think sex is not only still taboo, but in a strange sense more taboo than ever. And what I mean by that is that obviously everyone in the world, regardless of where you're from now, if you have internet access, you can experience every possible sexual activity you could possibly imagine for free. At the same time, though, younger people, particularly millennials and Zoomers and younger people, are having less sex than ever. To a remarkable degree. And that's certainly the case in America. I don't know if that's the case in Europe. And so I think that there's actually a repressive effect of having everything out in the open. Like now there's no, as opposed to before where, people were, in a sense, sex is more taboo, but people are actually having sex. They're actually connecting with other human beings. Yeah. And there's that power of going against what you think your sexuality is, perhaps, and having new experiences. And that was so much of a part of the fun for me of the occult in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s was that it was the wrong side of the tracks. It was dangerous. Exactly. It was hidden. It was dark, Yeah.
So there's a problem here, or a challenge, because you are absolutely right. In the sense, it's always been occult, right? It's always been hidden. It's always been underground. And I like, as you know, to have these metaphors of the flowers and the garden, and things grow underground. What you see are the beautiful flowers, but it won't flower unless it has solid roots in moist, dark blackness filled with toxic minerals that are transformed alchemically into nutrition. It's amazing. And if you translate that into a kind of a human behavior or human culture, perhaps it's better that some things are occult and underground. And that's very, very difficult in a time like ours, when everybody is, in a way, self-censoring themselves by flaunting themselves on social media. You present an image of yourself how you want to be perceived, but that may not at all be what you actually feel. But you're more concerned about the reflection surface than about the real feelings. So it's a very problematic thing, I think. And I do believe, again, taking jumping off from this transgressive thing, is that this power, when people point their fingers on you saying that you're dangerous, whether you are or not, that's besides the point. But you can, in a way, profit from being regarded as the outsider, as the dangerous one, as the threat. And another analogy that I like very much, specifically when talking about, the symbol of Satan, is that Satan is the immune system of the organism. Satan presses where it hurts, where it's ill. Because if the organism doesn't heal or fixes some kind of, surgery, whatever, then the entire organism is threatened. That's the satanic force pointing Satan's finger at, you fucking hypocrites, fix this stuff because this is insane, this is sick, this is, infected. And the healthy culture will, of course, fix that. They will listen and heed that, call it satanic, call it, emergency, call it whatever. But I do believe that that has been the function of every little culture that has become too repressed, too dominant, too oppressive in a way. There will always be a rebellion. And that rebellion is ultimately what creates the health.
I love that. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, like, as you know, it's like Jen in the 80s and 90s was terrifying. Like, like the modern primitives, all of that, like people don't realize like how terrifying that was at the time. And now it's like everyone, and it was interesting to see. It was so wonderful to see that suddenly there was so much interest and mass acceptance in Jen's work at the end of her life, and I was really glad that she was able to experience that. And I want to say, and your work is part of this. I'm amazed at how much receptivity and interest there is in this material. That was not at all what I thought was going to be the case. I was hoping it was the case, but I figured it was a lost cause, and it's definitely not now. I think there's so much an unprecedented level of interest in this material because now it's been made open. It's been made non-occult, and of course, but people are not only not afraid of it, I think they're very accepting of it, and because honestly, it probably is more intelligent and makes more sense than what they're being given otherwise. Yeah. So,
and I think also it's. This culture that we're living in is so, paradoxical or contradictory in a way too, because we have, as you say, a lot of access, but it's not the same as, immediate integration of wisdom and insight. Quite on the contrary, because the system becomes stressed and you can't see what's what. And if you have some kind of spiritual inclination or a magical inclination and you're moving in one direction, unfortunately, it seems that many young people, and it's always been like this in a way, they gravitate towards what's difficult to interpret. They don't go for what seems simple and accessible and easy to understand, because it's almost like there's an inherent message there saying this can't be for real because I understand it. It's a kind of you put people down, and they have to have a system that's completely takes years to master. You have to go through.
Yeah. I was like that for sure. Yeah.
At the end, you might get a funny hat, but what? So I think that obfuscation and too many symbols on the spiritual path may have been necessary in more oppressive times, but I don't think that's the case. And the Satanic Bible is one example, but also the Psychic Bible is another example. Someone who just that's an anthology, but it's just like here it is. These were our experimentations, and it's not really too symbolic or too complex. It's pretty straightforward. I love that. I love that the things that are usable are explained in a way that will make people inspired to really jump at it and try to work on it. And that, I think Jen was smart, talking about sigils all the time. Before Jen, Spare wasn't that well known. Grant was a little bit earlier on, but he was, again, very, symbol heavy. He was kind of obfuscated too, weaving things in like Crowley did in way too much fluff, way too much system. And then Topi came and just like an IoT also. You do this and strip this sentence and then just, jack off or do whatever ecstatic experience you have. And, wham, that's magic.
Yeah.
And it really works, and worked for a lot of people, and it still works because it's like, truly perennial techniques coming from many different cultures. And then, moving like any other kind of philosophical insight or magical insight. But by Jen's thing was to, hammer out the message on and on and on and on. And of course, it takes hold sooner or later.
Absolutely.
That is not only susceptible, but also receptive enough, intelligent enough to receive.
Definitely. Yeah, I've been amazed at the response to that book too. I mean, as you know, I spent 5 years working on that, but it's been, and that was the second edition, so it had already been worked on by the original editor in the early 90s. So I think that, but it went everywhere. I mean, I saw Grimes tweeted that she was reading it. It's incredible. So I think that I really think that book will have a tremendous influence going into the future. And of course, you worked on it as well. It's like I feel like I wanted that book to be the next to the Blue Brick Crowley book and the Golden Dawn Regardie book. Then there's Psychic Bible. So
absolutely, it belongs on the same shelf. Absolutely, and I would say in terms of LaVey on that shelf, I would put his 2 final books on that shelf, perhaps more so than the Satanic Bible. There was one called The Devil's Notebook that came out in '92, and then there was one published just after he died called Satan Speaks, and they are non-thematic. They're just filled with his essays, very humoristic, very much like Mencken or Ambrose Bierce, kind of satirical, bordering on cynic, but always hilariously funny, yet carrying a lot of signal, a lot of magical inspiration and concepts. He was such a creative magician. So I would put those books together with Psychic Bible and the Regardie tome and Crowley's First Equinox, these things.
Right.
Many other things. Some Pete Carroll should be in there also.
Yeah.
There have been many, many good things over the years. But what's next?
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons why I've leaned so hard into podcasting is because, as you know, it's like when you said earlier, when you're young, you run around and interact with all these kind of secret societies and groups, and then finally you think you're the only one, and then you meet other people who have, all the same books, and there's just oh my God, we got to talk about this. So, and that the internet has kind of reduced that. And I remember in that time period really being in these occult spaces and having these truly what felt like forbidden conversations, and just being like so angry. It's like, it's like, this is where all the intelligent people are, and in comparison the rest of the world is so unevolved and Neanderthal in a way, and if only people could get this. And that, for me, like you mentioned, being at LaVey's house and that kind of just hanging out and watching movies, and there are these transmissions happening, some of which you're aware of and some of which you're not aware of, and you're just kind of absorbing by osmosis how someone lives their life, which is kind of the most important thing, and their influences and all that. But and so that was kind of lost in the internet era, but I think podcasts bring it back. And they make, in a sense, they make in an even better sense in a way, because it, I think probably 10,000 people are going to listen to this conversation. So
absolutely, I think you're absolutely right, because there is the further away we are from each other, the worse it gets in a way. So you can have very efficient tweeting back and forth, or Instagram Messenger, or all these things, or even a telephone call, but it doesn't give this kind of face-to-face interaction. And I don't think, of course, it's better to share the same space, and because then there might be physical, magnetic, chemical things going on at the same time, but at least this is a real conversation, and it's kind of mind-boggling that you can be where you are and I can be where I am. We're doing this in real time.
Yeah. It's like we have sorcerers' crystal balls that we're communicating.
It's beautiful. I do agree, and then it's sort of, and I also like very much that when people say that, well, it's an audio only podcast. Well, but I always suggest that let's do video anyway, because it does create a different kind of dynamic when you talk to someone than just like into a void, a screen.
Yeah, absolutely. But also even just on the thinking it's audio only, that forgets that when people listen to it, people don't just listen to podcasts in the dark. They're probably driving somewhere, or they're on a subway, or they're going about their day, they're doing the dishes. So they're surrounded by the world while they're listening to it. And I mean, how many profound experiences have you had just listening to music on a subway or something like that, or on a drive? And I think it's the same with podcasts. People take it. The thing that people don't remember is that people don't consume podcasts on their computer as they do with video. They consume it while moving, interacting with the real world, which I think is really, really powerful. Other mediums outside of music are not like that. So I think there's something to that.
And it's true also for audiobooks. I haven't not really gotten into it yet, but my wife, she goes on walks and stuff and listens to books like she's currently listening to the LaVey book, and it's so weird. I've listened in on it. It's basically, like a professional actor reading my book. And it's so weird to hear my own words expressed by someone else. But anyway, people like that a lot for the very same reason. They can listen while they're driving, they can listen when they're walking. And if people can't find the time to actually sit down and read heavy tomes of heavy literature, then it's much better that they listen to it.
Yeah,
than not take part of it.
At first, I mean, as you know, most of publishing is much, much more slanted towards audiobooks. They do much better than published books now. And at first, I was very cynical about that, having just spent my entire life in the publishing industry in one faculty or another, starting from working in bookstores. It's just for me at first, it was like part of this slide into illiteracy, but maybe not. Maybe that's me being cynical. It's like, it's great that so many people more are consuming actual content that is not even the success of somebody like Joe Rogan. It's like that. Those are 3-hour-long podcasts. They're not tweets or Instagrams. And I think that's a really, really, really positive cultural development. And I'm the more I think about it, the more amazed I become about it, actually.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's the human mind, the human language, and the human voice, conjoined.
I mean, it's what we're evolved to do. It's like we're supposed to be talking to each other, not tweeting at each other. So interesting. Well, I wanted to ask you, there is, in the end of this book, you have a dialogue between Jen and Anton LaVey, and they talk a lot about music, actually. I was really curious were you around both of them while they were interacting, or what was that like?
No.
Okay.
It was a tape that Jen provided me with a copy of, because I don't know if you know that story. I should really tell the story of how all of this came about. It's all thanks to Jen, and I'll try to keep it condensed. Then we can return to their conversation. Basically, when you're young, as I was at this time, active in Topi, I loved music, so I wanted to have a band. Of course, my band was called White Stains, and the very first music that we recorded, because we were kind of a psychedelic rock band at the time, it was a song called Sweet Jane, just like the Lou Reed song. However, this song was about Anton LaVey, Jane Mansfield, and their relationship. Set.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah, and that was the first record that ever came out with White Stains, and it was I think it was even Topi Scan Records or something. And Jan loved it, and he said, I have LaVey's address. Why don't you send him a copy? And this was in 1988, and I said absolutely, because I was such a big Anton LaVey fan in a way. But for me, he was this kind of untouchable. I wouldn't say. Quasi divine, but quasi infernal presence over there in another part of the world. Anyway, I sent the record, and then I got a letter back from him, appreciating the initiative and making me a member of the Church of Satan, because that was his shtick. He handed people memberships, and I was like mind blown and overjoyed, because, and so that was in a way Jan's doing by just in the moment, why don't you do this? And I did, and it turned out to be another lifelong friendship and important mentorship, or whatever you want to call it. So they had met while Psychic TV were touring. They were well aware of each other because they were both controversial figures. And Jen was very open-minded, meeting people like, Kenneth Grant, basically an older generation, and networking in the US, in Europe, wherever. And they met, and this transcription, that's not their first meeting, because I think that was maybe also from 88, but they had met sometime before that also. And that conversation was, I think, the evening before some Psychic TV gig. So they start talking about that, and they are at the Black House. And one of the pet subjects of LaVey was this thing of bombastic music. And that doesn't necessarily mean Beethoven, where everything is crammed to the max with some kind of maximalism. It can also be, bombastic music can also be kind of stripped. It just needs to have a strong emotional timbre, a strong emotional potency. And so they talk about that. And I find, it's like there are many instances where I want to be like a fly on the wall. One of those would be Jen and LaVey talking together. And in this sense, we have at least a little snippet where they talk about music. So I just felt that I needed to include that, in part because Jen was the one who actually, again, made all of this happen in a way. And he's still out there as a phantom force, because if that hadn't happened, you and I wouldn't be here now talking either, right?
There you go.
And it's the ultimate psychedelic magician in a way, creating new circles and layers, and, it's all moving forwards. And then I have to quickly interject with another brief story. After that thing, we were friends. I had originally gotten to know about LaVey because of the Satanic Bible in occult bookstores in Stockholm, of course, but he was also present in Swedish men's magazines because they were still around at the time. And he was so syndicated, these, stories from the Black House of the naked ladies, and it was just, really kitschy and nice material. And I'd seen that as a boy and as a young teenager, and thought it was so cool. So,
yeah.
Life moved on. I published the Satanic Bible in Swedish. LaVey died. I kept in touch with Blanche, and, just life took over. And then much later, I would say around 2014, perhaps, some guy in Sweden got in touch with me saying he had something he wanted to show me. That's always intriguing. So I did. And it turned out that he had bought, he was a big collector of LaVeyana that I didn't know about in Sweden. And he had bought like the negatives and prints from an estate of a German paparazzo who had been stationed in Hollywood in the 50s and 60s. And he was the one who had taken all these photos that I had seen in those men's magazines that were the original sort of erotic crystallization images that made me sort of love all of this for many reasons. And then, so that's why I made this book with those photos, Californian Infernal. And it's all of these extremely cool pictures of them together, and scenes from the Black House, and it's really unique material. So it's in a way like this era and these images and the forces behind them came back to sort of bite me in the butt. And that was actually the instigation that made me want to do the documentary, which started shortly after this book came out in 2016. So, now perhaps I can leave it behind me. It's not that I necessarily want to leave it, but at least now I've sort of summed it up in a way that I can move on, because I've given it back or given it forward to people, younger people who are hopefully interested in this.
I think so. So where can people find the latest, the Anton LaVey book and California Infernal, and all the other books and projects that you work on?
Yeah, I think the easiest way, specifically if you're in America, and also taking into consideration how insanely expensive postage is now, I think they go to the Great Beast, go to the company beginning with an A and ending with a Amazon. And just get them, because they have possibly the cheapest postage rates anyway, and they're all available still. California Infernal and the LaVey book, and all of my other books too. Just look for my name, I guess, is the best thing.
And is there do you have a central website or social media that I think you have a bunch of websites, right?
Yeah, the central one would be my website, which is carlabrahamson.com. It has all the links to all the other social media platforms and stuff. And it's Carl with a C and Abrahamson with 2 S's.
Wonderful. Well, maybe we should put a bookmark in it for now, but I would love to have you back on the show soon, for sure. That was a good conversation. Thank you. All right. Hope you really enjoyed that. Check out Carl's stuff and definitely download the new free guided meditation from magic.me. 7 minutes a day, 7 days, your life will radically transform. Start.magic.me, start.magic.me. I will see you in class.